It's going to make it even harder to bring gravitas to an interview like the one we're about to have with the former director of national intelligence, John Ratcliffe.
We're so sorry.
There you go. We're not wearing pajamas. We're wearing suits.
You're such an important, serious guy, but
hey. I'm glad you're having a good time.
I'm glad you're having a good time. You have that good time because I have your back. Basically what it is. Thank you very much for being here, sir. Former director of national intelligence. You know about classification. You know about documents. You know how things are supposed to be stored, the process that's supposed to be followed. Your reaction to the revelation yesterday that more documents have been found at Joe Biden's home that he presumably took when he was vice president, have been there for years, and now this is the fourth revelation. What do you take away from all this?
That it gets worse every day for President Biden. Look, the way it's going, I would half expect Karine Jean-Pierre to change her mantra at the next White House press conference from Joe Biden takes classified documents seriously to Joe Biden takes classified documents. I mean, we've gone from one set of documents in one location to 4 different sets of documents in 4 different locations, and we frankly don't know where that's going to end, where we're going to be at this point next week. And so that makes it really difficult for Joe Biden. You know, cooperation is not a defense, is one of the things that the White House keeps talking about. And also, it can't be an inadvertent mistake when you do it 4 times. One time, maybe it's an inadvertent mistake, but, you know, 4 times. So not to mention, of course, his, you know, his admission that anyone that would do this would be irresponsible. Well, in legal terms, you know, that's essentially an admission of gross negligence, which is the legal standard. So all of that from a legal standpoint. My concern as the former DNI is the national security standpoint, the fact that classified documents were kept at a house where a drug addict who has colleagues from communist China and unsavory oligarchs from Ukraine would have access to that. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? So, you know, I think, again, it gets worse every day for President Biden with regard to this issue.
Director Ratcliffe, I'd love to ask you about 2 red flags. How big of an aberration you believe these 2 aspects of this story are. One, I've seen some people say that the dirty little secret of Washington, D.C. is how actually classified documents at various levels of classification are somewhat treated irresponsibly, are scattered around. I'm curious if that's true in your experience. But then secondarily, I'd also like to ask you, how odd is it that it's the president's lawyers who discovered these in some office doing I don't know what, some very expensive moving services for the president? I mean, it seems that that's a detail that needs a little more attention.
Yeah, so to the first point, Will, on the issue of classified documents, people have to understand that there isn't just one, you know, for every classified documents, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of copies that go to people that have clearances that sometimes walk around Washington, D.C. with those in what we call lock bags. And so, you know, over time, the idea that such documents aren't in places or stored in accordance with legal laws and regulations is not surprising. So I think that's accurate, and I think that's something, you know, that we need to address when we're talking about things that can pose a grave national security concern. So you know, I think that's the first issue. Your second question was remind me
about the lawyers. This first came to the public under the guise of lawyers finding this in Joe Biden's closet.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the explanation that they give is that they were moving documents at the Penn Biden Center. You know, some of that just doesn't add up from the standpoint of, you know, the timeline of everything that has taken place. And, you know, and frankly, we don't know that those personal lawyers would have had the clearances to look at these documents either. So, you know, this is where it gets into the issue of where are we going to get answers to these questions, and I think that's where a new Congress that is convened with committees that are committed to getting answers to those things. We certainly can't count on the Biden Justice Department or the Biden White House to be providing transparent answers to that. So hopefully when people are sworn in under oath before Congress, before these different investigatory committees, we'll get answers to those questions.
But why is it that his personal lawyers are in charge of retrieving documents? I didn't see Rudy Giuliani or any of Trump's lawyers. I saw armed FBI agents raiding Mar-a-Lago. And in this case, we have a Biden family that I believe is compromised by our greatest threat, our greatest enemy, the Communist Chinese Party. And as you mentioned, a drug addict who, by the way, doesn't just have his dad asking him for money. He has ex-wives and strippers and his kids. I mean, he needs money. And so he is somebody who we should be looking at. Where is the FBI raiding this house? And UPenn, by the way.
Well, I will tell you, as the former DNI, looking, at the disparity in the treatment between President Biden and former President Trump, I mean, it's remarkable. And, you want to talk about dirty little secrets. I mean, I think that what we saw was an unprecedented raid of the former president as a way of targeting a political opponent. I think that was intended to lead to an unprecedented prosecution that has now hit a roadblock, if you will, named Joe Biden. I don't think that the Biden Department of Justice ever thought they'd be sitting around saying, well, how are we possibly going to prosecute former President Trump for conduct that President Biden has so clearly committed at a level that is so more egregious and with such a greater frequency. And I think that's why they are in the mess that they are. And I think that's why you see Merrick Garland punting with another special counsel.
John, we've heard in times past, mostly surrounding Trump, you can't indict a sitting president. But can you indict someone for something they did as vice president?
Yeah, I mean, not indicting a sitting president is a standing policy at the Department of Justice, and there certainly is a precedent for going after vice presidents. I mean, Spiro Agnew, for instance. So the question is, at the end of the day, with regard to, frankly, President Biden or former President Trump, is you have the legal questions first. In other words, are elements of a crime or criminality there? And again, as I said, Joe Biden has essentially indicted himself from a legal standpoint with his own thing. But the second question for any prosecutor is it in the public interest to do so? And that's where you'll hear arguments that it's not in the public interest to do so on behalf of President Biden. But then again, it'll be difficult for Jack Smith, the special counsel investigating President Trump, to proceed on a different path at the same time.
And by the way, I think it's worth underlining one more time to your point. Joe Biden, in his essence, admitted to guilt in this crime in saying it was inadvertent. It means the crime took place. Your intent is a secondary step at that point. But, it's interesting. We're talking about the details of this potential crime. And the real story probably still lies underneath. And, John, you've talked about this. It's who benefits if the president is a leaky vessel, if his son is compromised, or if is it China who is funding his library? Some are suggesting the documents are about Ukraine. You tweeted out this week, Ukraine, is that the same Ukraine where Biden threatened to pull $1 billion in U.S. aid unless Ukraine's president fired Viktor Shokin, the prosecutor investigating Burisma, a company paying Hunter $83,000 a month? I mean, you can't indict a sitting president, but you sure better have an investigation of whether or not the sitting president is a leaky vessel that is compromised.
Well, we'll go back to the first impeachment trial of President Trump and recall the testimony of the Ukrainian U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, where she said out of thousands and thousands of Ukrainian companies, she received a briefing in preparation for her confirmation relating exactly to one, and that was Burisma. And she was told to, defer all questions on that to the office of the vice president. So they knew it was a problem then. And of course, in the role as DNI, when I stepped in and had access to certain intelligence, I became more concerned about these issues. The problem is, as the DNI, I'm not an investigator or a prosecutor, and so it's incumbent on the FBI to pursue those things. And frankly, I've been concerned at the level of seriousness that has been addressed with regard to Hunter Biden when, I personally, without disclosing anything that's classified, seen troubling intelligence with regard to the activities of members of the Biden family.
Yeah, I would say I'm not worried about the seriousness of the FBI and the DOJ. I'm worried about the politicization and that we're turning into Cuba. We're turning into some third world country with 2 tiers of justice. And I think you couldn't have a better example than all of this. I want to move on to one other topic that's very interesting. There have been an increase in UFO sightings in the past 2 years, and U.S. intelligence report is saying you've pushed for more disclosures about the UFO sightings when you were DNI head of the DNI. I want to know about that, and I also want to know about if there's any appetite in the government to finally release also the JFK files.
Well, when I became shortly after I became the DNI in June of 2020, I was the first one to publicly acknowledge that there was a unidentified aerial phenomenon task force through the Senate Intelligence Committee because I wanted there to be greater transparency to the American people about the number of sightings of things that are unexplained. And I know everyone gets caught up on alien life and all of that, but my concern as the Director of National Intelligence was if anyone, foreign adversary, regardless of how you define foreign adversary, have technologies that the United States don't have, we need to find out more about that. And what we found that was Navy pilots and Air Force pilots were, discouraged from reporting that. They thought that it would impair their careers. We need to have information if there are technologies out there. And very clearly, as this most recent report reveals, the sightings are increasing, which is a good thing because that means we're getting more honest reporting from our Navy and Air Force pilots. But it gives us more information. We need to find out when there are, and there very clearly are now, hundreds of unexplained sightings, meaning that there's no natural phenomenon involved, there's no visual disturbance, it's not clutter or debris or birds or anything else, but objects that demonstrate technologies that seem to defy the law of physics and capabilities that we don't have as the world's superpower. Our role in the federal government is to provide for the common defense, and we can't do that if someone else has technologies that are better than we have. So all of this is a very, a good development from my perspective, and I'm glad that they're pursuing some of the things that I was pushing as DNI. Your second question with regard to other classified information, I don't want to disclose conversations with former President Trump, but he did want to declassify the documents surrounding the Kennedy assassination, and there was some pushback at different levels, and ultimately he made the decision not to do it at that period of time. But obviously there's a lot of documentation out there of different things that I think the American people deserve to know about.
Yeah. We need to restore confidence in our institutions, and I think transparency and some truth-telling and treating us like adults and citizens who are in charge of our government as opposed to servants.
Well, that's true.
Would work.
So, John, treat us like an adult here. You've seen the intel. It's January 15th in the year 2023. Are aliens real?
Good.
Well, I can't talk to you about, any potential alien life. So I'll just leave it at that.
There you go. What does that answer say?
I don't know.
I don't know.
So that's funny because the first answer he gave about it made me think maybe there was a foreign government that had the technology. But now I'm thinking, this is
You wish we'd put our pajamas back on right now?
or our tinfoil hats.
Yeah, he's like, I'm never coming back ever again. John Ratcliffe, thanks for your service to the country.
Yeah,
thanks for indulging us this morning. We appreciate it.
Anytime.
All right.
Great to see y'all.
Great seeing you too.
I'm Steve Ducey.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.